welcome you all to this panel discussion on a very important topic, role of labor intermediaries in migration issues and challenges. I welcome our CEO, Shri Abbagani Ramu, PG Shri Yogeshwar Sangwan, all our MEA officials, stellar panel moderated by Dr. Meera Sethi, who will subsequently introduce the panelists in detail, and friends and colleagues who have joined us from various parts of the country from different organizations. A very warm welcome. In the beginning, let me just mention certain housekeeping rules so that we have a smooth discussion without any interruption. So I request everyone except the panel to keep their microphones on mute so that there are no audio disturbances hearing the panelists. The panelists may keep their videos on throughout. If we go on a lower video bandwidth, maybe I'll request everyone to turn off their videos as well. There's a dedicated slot for discussion towards the end where we'll take up the views and comments of everyone who's attending this discussion. In the meanwhile, you can also use the group chat option to raise your points, which the moderator may be able to see, or in case if she's not able to see, then we'll assist her in that regard. And I'm sure all the panelists will also be able to read queries, specific queries which are addressed to them. So those are the brief housekeeping rules that we need to keep in mind for a smooth discussion. Without wasting any further time, allow me to welcome our CEO, Shri Abbagani Ramu, to make the inaugural remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's very happy to join you again once again. And there are many familiar faces. I've been attending last couple of webinars. So welcome all of you. So let me also welcome today's moderator, Dr. Meera Sethi, former special envoy to International Organization of Migration India, Dr. P.S. Vikrama Sekara, Vice President, Global Migration Policy Associates, Mr. Shabari Nair, Specialist, International Labour Organization, Dr. Praveena Podot, Professor, Center for Development Studies, Mr. Muhammad Maulana, President, Indian Personal Export Promotion Council, and all the participants. Thank you very much once again for joining us today. It's a very interesting topic, which is about the labor intermediary. The importance, as you know, that there is no need to re-emphasize, but without these connecting links between the labor who is going abroad and also the employers. So that is a very crucial link and crucial cog of this wheel of migration. So it is very, very important subject we have today, and of course it is a very interactive and a learning experience for Ministry of External Affairs officials to know the ground level issues, and also it is important to continue learning issues faced at the ground level. And of course, these intermediates, which include recruitment agents, employment agents, local and informal workers, unions, and non-profit organizations. They have been playing very important, crucial role in the interface between employee and employer. And also, their main job is to ensure the satisfaction of employee, and also if there is any dispute between the employee and employer, they are resolving. So the importance is continuously growing in the complexity of situations we are facing in the migration today. And this is the intermediaries is the only source of contact for people who are going abroad, especially the blue-collar workers, to get necessary government approvals and also navigating the migration process, particularly getting the immigration clearances. And they also ensure that before they go abroad, the immigrants, the employees are getting enough training through this pre-departure orientation training. So we have a management of this intermediate so far under the Immigration Act of 1983, which makes it mandatory to register RAs with the Protector General of Immigrants, and also provides detailed guidelines through our e-migrate portal. MEA has various mechanisms to rate these intermediaries, particularly recruitment agents, by way of 10 criteria. The important criteria are the immigration certificates obtained by them, and the number of immigrants, particularly the ECNR employees going abroad, and number of grievances resolved by them. So this is a rating mechanism. Of course, we are trying to improve the rating mechanisms in future also through the next immigration bill, which will be under discussion. And at the same time, it is important to note that their contribution. And there are also direct recruitment which happens through the foreign employer, so not going through the recruitment agencies. So in such cases, there are enough safeguards kept to safeguard the immigrants, which particularly, to mention some of them, the foreign employer required to get a permit from Protector General of Immigrants, and in case of women, they have to be recruited only through the state government run recruitment agencies, and they also need to provide a bank guarantee of US dollar equivalent to $2,500. This immigration process and management of immigrants have challenges also. The governance of the immigration, and there are issues which put in this one is exploitative wages and working conditions and high recruitment costs. The discrepancies in the employment contract and actual ground-less situation. So these are some challenges, but to address these challenges, we have various provisions, and the present act, which 1983 Act says there is a maximum charge can be charged by the recruitment agencies, and of course the employees also get assistance through various mechanisms available at the Ministry of External Affairs, Indian missions abroad, and the embassies and consulates. And there are Pravasi Bharatiya Seva Kendras also established in some foreign countries, and also in some of the states where the source of immigration is very high. And there is also a facility called Community Welfare Fund to take care of their pressing needs. So, but there are also sometimes issues of accessing the institutional mechanism by these employees because of different reasons. One is that there is not a regularity of the status. There are irregular migration happening. These are the main reasons which cause the difficulty to access the institutional mechanism, and sometimes they are not aware of this the mechanism which we have. So of course there is various efforts to reach out to our media campaign to tell that what are the facilities we have. But most importantly, it is also important to know about the functioning of intermediaries to form the policy, to revise the policy time to time. So that is also important role we have in the policy making. So to conclude, before my remarks, let me say that I think for all of us, the policy makers, intermediaries, and recruitment agents, and think tanks, for all of us, core concern for all of us should be the interest and welfare of migrants. This should remain always with us, whatever role we are playing, because ultimately they are the persons who are taking the biggest risk and facing the challenges, like the Indian farmers who takes the biggest risk, and we do not realize the risk and the difficulty they face when the food comes to our table. I think similar process they are experiencing because they are there in the villages and the semi-urban areas, suddenly going to a foreign country where it is like a cultural shock. So it is important for all of us to work together and see that their risk-reward ratio is favorable to them. So just to let me quote one Gandhiji's talisman. So that is very relevant. I felt today I should quote here because we are dealing with the subject of immigrants who are going abroad to make their life, facing so many odds. So to quote Gandhiji's talisman, whenever you are in doubt or whenever the self became too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and weakest person whom you may have seen and ask yourself if the step you are contemplating is going to be of any use to that person. So with these few words, I welcome all the participants and moderator for this very interactive and useful discussion. Thank you so much. I look forward to hear all of you. Thank you.
I would now request Dr. Meera Sethi, who's the former envoy of IOM to India, to kindly moderate the proceedings. Over to you, Meera.
I must say the sound has been quite very low and it was not possible to hear everything. So I do hope that I'm heard well and loud and clear by everybody. All right, so we have 4 distinguished panelists today who will be speaking to the subject of role of labor intermediaries, issues and challenges. And for those of you, the practitioners and academicians who are involved in this subject, you know the importance of this area. It is basically the recruitment agents, the intermediaries are basically establishing the relationship of labor demand and supply. They have a major impact on the labor market. They also establish the capital-labor relations, and they are the key mediators between the employers and the workers. And I'm glad to say that a lot of work has been ongoing in India and also at the regional level when you look at the Colombo process countries and the efforts that have been made to harmonize and standardize the intermediary process. So with those simple words, a few lines, I'd like to bring in my panelists and introduce the first panelist to you, Dr. Piasari Vikramasekera, who I've had the opportunity to work with and meet a few years ago. He's currently the Vice President of the Global Migration Policy Associates and will be basically speaking on the normative framework on migration of recruitment agencies. He has been with the ILO for 25 years and also has been teaching in the University of Sri Lanka. So let me call on Piasari, please. Over to you, sir.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, distinguished participants. Thank you, moderator. And let me start by thanking the India Center for Migration, particularly Dr. Surabhi Singh, for the kind invitation to join this online discussion. Although I have participated in India Center migration meetings physically a few years back. Within the 10 minutes also available, I shall raise a few important points because we cannot go into details. As mentioned, labor intermediaries are labor recruiters, which is a mix of people, formal, informal, legal, illegal, registered, unregistered, large, small, sub-agents, and all kind of. Now, let me start by saying that I shall also focus on low-skilled and semi-skilled migrant workers and their recruitment, because these are the group that is vulnerable. There's no question that the private recruitment industry had served a very useful role in Asia in matching labor demand and supplies, and as the moderator said, and also expanding overseas employment opportunities for millions of migrant workers. At the same time, I mean, recruitment issues have been on the agenda because of malpractices by certain groups, certain segments of the group, which have led to serious erosion of benefits from labor migration. So now I am not going to talk about the COVID situation, but it's a very grim scenario. Because I just heard that in Sri Lanka, this time only 400 recruitment agencies registered, about half the normal number, because both the industry bureau and the agents are in serious issues, problems. There is an array of international instruments, conventions, recommendations, non-binding frameworks which govern international labor migration. All ILO, all universal human rights instruments, ILO core conventions, migrant-specific conventions. There are 3 ILO conventions and the UN convention, and all other labor standards apply to migrant workers. Given that unethical recruitment practices lead to situations of trafficking and forced labor, there are more international instruments which are applicable, like the Protocol on Trafficking and then all these forced labor instruments. Now, coming to specific standards, I shall focus on the ILO standards. The main instrument is the Private Employment Agencies Convention 1997, number 181, and the related recommendation. And then there is Domestic Workers Convention 2011 and related recommendation 201, which applies to both domestic workers as well as migrant domestic workers. And then there's the Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention, P29. Now, let me focus on C181, Private Employment Agencies Convention. The previous ILO conventions, 97 and 143, these were designed primarily with public employment services in mind, because in the 50s, 60s, they were the dominant player. But by the end of 80s, early 90s, of course, the situation had drastically changed. Private intermediaries were predominant. So this is why convention ILO actually introduced Convention 181, which it recognizes the legitimacy of private employment agencies, which are frowned upon earlier, coexisting with public employment services. At the same time, it recognized them. At the same time, it recognized the need to protect migrant workers from these agencies. So the convention has a lot of provisions to regulate these agencies and prevent abuses. A key provision is 7.1. Private employment agencies shall not charge directly or indirectly, in whole or in part, any fees or costs to workers. Of course, Article 7.2 makes it a little flexible, saying there can be exceptions. Now, this is the key principle which is underlined other legislation also. It's employer pays principle. Special protection for migrant workers is outlined in Article 8, which requires member states to seek adequate protection for migrant workers and prevent abuses who are placed in other countries. And also it recommends bilateral labor agreements between countries to prevent these abuses. Now, Convention 189, I don't know, Dr. Pravina might go into this because she's talking about women migrant workers. It's on domestic workers, again, local domestic workers, national domestic workers, as well as migrant domestic workers. Article 8 is on migrant domestic workers. Article 8, employment contracts. They should preferably receive a written job offer and enforceable contracts in the country of destination. And also countries should collaborate to ensure protection and also ensure conditions of repatriation. Article 15 specifically deals with private employment agencies and the abuses and protection of abuses. Adequate machinery for follow-up of complaints and abuses, provide for adequate protection, and then conclude bilateral agreements to prevent abuses, and also reiterate that no fees should be collected from them. Now, I will then go into IL non-binding frameworks. The first one is the multilateral framework of labor migration, 2006. It is a toolkit ILO introduced through tripartite negotiations for modifying or introducing migration laws in line with international instruments. It contains specific guidelines on recruitment agencies. Principle 13 says governments in both origin and destination countries should give due consideration to licensing and supervising recruitment and placement services for migrant workers, in line with the Private Employment Agencies Convention, which we just talked about. And then it has a number of guidelines actually to ensure this, to put this into practice. I am not going into detail because time is running out, I think. I hate to look at the moderator because Then the second non-binding framework is ILO General Principles and Operational Guidelines for Fair Recruitment. This was introduced in 2016, again through tripartite negotiations, and in 2019 it was updated by adding the definition of recruitment fees and related costs, because there was a lot of confusion about this. All parties asking what are recruitment costs, what are related costs. Now, Shabari, my colleague, said he would like to talk about this in more detail, so I will not go into details. There are 13 general principles, and then operational guidelines are for various parties, governments, enterprises, public employment services, labor recruiters, meaning private employment agencies, and employers. So the key principle is respect for human and labor rights of migrant workers by all the stakeholders, and also the key principle that no fees should be levied. What are the other frameworks? Is Sustainable Development Agenda goals. Goal 10, reducing inequalities. 10.7, facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration. Now, under this, there's an indicator 10.7.1 on recruitment cost. This shows how much recruitment is actually important on the international agenda. It reads as recruitment cost borne by employee as a proportion of monthly income earned in the country of destination. The rationale is that, if the worker has to pay 1 year's salary as recruitment fees, even 2 or 3 months, of course, it does not benefit him. The idea, instruments say it should be zero cost, but we know in practice it is not the case. So the idea of this indicator is actually to monitor and try to.
So you have 2 minutes left. You have 2 more minutes to wrap up.
That is for 10 minutes, huh? Or 12 minutes.
No. So you have finished 10 minutes.
Global Compact on Migration 2018, Objective 6 deals with fair and ethical recruitment. Again, Shabar said he will talk about it. So I think in that case, I will talk about challenges to fair recruitment processes. We talked about instruments, normative frameworks. So what? How do we enforce this? What is the situation on the ground? Of course, there are many challenges. Ratification gaps, because only 5 countries in Southeast Asia and 2 countries in South Asia have ratified any migrant worker instrument. But of course, many countries have ratified UN human rights instruments and ILO core conventions, which are also important because some of the violations relate to forced labor trafficking. Then see 181, only 3 countries in Asia, Fiji, Japan, and Mongolia. I recall India had a detailed discussion organized by the Giri Labour Institute in 2003 on the Convention on Private Employment Agencies. I don't know what came out of it. C189 on Philippines, Protocol, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Then there are legal and regulatory gaps. I will only highlight that. Although we talk about zero costs, many countries have legalized these fees. So how do you reconcile this?
And then you have 2 minutes, sir.
1?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
And you have to wrap up.
Okay, sub-agents are not, there are sub-agents. Of course, they are ubiquitous. Everybody knows about them, but they cannot be regulated each. There are, some people say they are a necessary evil, but they perform useful services. Then poor governance in GCC countries. So the main point I want to highlight is the sponsorship system, kafala system. You may migrate safely, orderly, but at the end of the day, you are at the mercy of your employer. You cannot leave the employment, you can leave even the place of work, and you cannot change your jobs. How can you actually apply and talk about fair recruitment? And then rent-seeking intermediaries, you sell visas, free visa system in the market like commodities. We are talking about human beings, not labor or person export. Yeah, right. Enforcement gaps. Again, the point is there are too many people looking for too few jobs. I recall Bangladesh, when they wanted to register people, send workers to Malaysia for plantation work. 1.4 million workers registered, but Malaysia offered during the MOU period, 3 years, only 10,000 jobs. So you can see the gap. Okay. And then lack of political will. Then information and dissemination gaps. We are talking about all these communication gaps, all these frameworks. Are private employment agencies aware of these development and initiatives? Are there any attempts to brief them? Their involvement in these processes. MUO's bilateral agreements are not even shared with them. So I think I cannot go into other things. My time is almost up. So I can see Mira frowning at me. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. I can, if you want, I can join in the open discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You see, you have so much experience and in so many different regions. When you look at Europe and Middle East and Asia, so it's a pity we only give you 12 minutes. Actually, we gave you 12 minutes. All right, thank you very much for highlighting all the various instruments and also showing to us some of the challenges that we have when it comes to enforcement. I call on our next speaker, who is Mr. Shabri Nair, who's a migration policy specialist for South Asia. He's based here in ILO in New Delhi as part of the Decent Work technical support team. I've also had the opportunity to work with him earlier, and he right now covers 7 of the SAARC countries, and I realize Bhutan is missing from there. And he has also been very, very instrumental in when the Global Compact was being negotiated. He spent, I think, about nearly 2 years shifting between Geneva and New York, and played a key role in the negotiations on the Global Compact. So with that, I call on Shabri to make his comments, and you have 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mira. And I think, like in any other webinar, we have to always start by asking, can you hear me and can you see me? Yes?
Perfect, clear.
Great. Thanks so much. What a pleasure. And thank you. Big thanks to the Ministry of External Affairs and through the MEA, ICM, and Dr. Surabhi for this invitation. It is always nice to be in a conversation with regards to the country that I come from myself. So I'm very glad. Out of the, you mentioned, Mira, that I only cover 7 countries and not Bhutan, and that's because Bhutan is not yet a member of the ILO. So, inshallah, when that happens, let's see. But in the meantime, thank you very much for this opportunity. You know, I've been thinking about how exactly to put forward some of these perspectives on intermediaries and the roles that they play. I'm the son of migrant workers. My father migrated to Qatar in 1975, which is where I grew up and spent the best part of my formative years. And I remember I was talking to my dad earlier, asking, he moved from Bombay, and I know that most of the recruitment agencies, I see the presence of Ali here, Ali Rajan here. So, and I can imagine that Bombay has such a huge role to play as far as the recruitment industry is concerned, like Delhi. But in this case, when dad moved, he had an interview at Ambernath, and he was living in Andheri. Now, between Andheri and Ambernath, those days in 74, 75, would take an hour and a half by train, followed by bus, and it's a pretty much of a distance. So he left home early, got there on time for the interview, rang the bell at the apartment where the recruiter from the employer himself had come from Qatar, rang the bell, the recruiter opened the door, he said, Gopi, that's my father's name. He said, Gopinath, yes, sir, have got the job. You know, that was 1975 recruitment as a result of punctuality. And today we are moving in terms of the conversation where the agencies themselves have such a key role to play. You know, I want to specifically also refer to the points that was made by the Joint Secretary, Sir, spoke about the 1983 Immigration Act. Now, if you look at the Immigration Act itself, the points that relate to recruitment are pretty comprehensive, right? However, come 2019, the draft immigration bill indeed talks about a whole range of other considerations, keeping in mind the changes that have happened in recruitment over the last many years. Now, the 2019 bill is yet to be endorsed and tabled, but I think what we now need to look at is also in the context of COVID and how COVID has now changed things going forward over the next many years. I think one of the important and salient aspects that has been mentioned in the 2019 immigration bill is the registration and rating of recruitment agencies, but not just the agencies, but also of sub-agents. So let's talk about how labor intermediaries speaking, I can imagine the kind of complications they have to deal with within their own supply chains. And I think it's so important for us to take that into consideration and not look at the labor recruitment as one single entity, but look at it in its entire complexities. You know, one of the things that I was so struck by from the salient features of the 2019 immigration bill is the duties and the functions of the RA. And what is really interesting about that is that it states it is centered on the comprehensive keyword here welfare of immigrants and their keyword again empowerment. So the words welfare and empowerment are very key to all the conversations that we should be having in the context of recruitment. If you look at the Global Compact for Migration, it has 10 guidelines. And this is the GCM that was adopted in 2018, India being one of the most important signatories from the South Asian context. It actually talks about, out of these 10 guidelines, the very first one is that it should be people-centered. Now, if it has to be people-centered, then the entire aspect of recruitment should be first conducted in a manner that keeps in mind exactly the words that the immigration bill, the revised bill, talks about in terms of welfare and the empowerment of people as its center perspectives. Pia Siri made reference to the ILO general principles and operational guidelines on recruitment fees and related costs. I won't go into details here, but we should always recognize the fact that there has been a huge debate constantly as to what the definition for recruitment fees and related costs are. Who pays these fees? Now, ILO, the general principles and operational guidelines of the ILO on fair recruitment says that it should be an employer-paid perspective, that employers should pay for it. However, that is not always the case. And we know that this comes with a lot of pragmatic approach as much as we need to look at the normative frameworks. So if we look at it from the pragmatic side, what exactly do recruitment fees entail? Recruitment fees are four kinds. One, they are payment for a recruitment service. Two, they are with a view to employing the worker. Three, they are for direct recruitment. Or four, to recover the recruitment costs from the worker after the worker leaves the country. Now, these are the four related recruitment costs. Now, recruitment fees. Now, related costs are a whole range of costs: medical, insurance, skills testing, training, orientation, equipment, admin fees, including travel and lodging. So it's a whole range of other things. This is where we need to pay our attention. And I think if we can pay our attention on the costs and fees, we would have a better understanding in being able to regulate and manage not just recruitment, but the entire governance system. Because at the end of the day, recruitment, let's accept it, is a private business. You know, they say in some countries, as far as recruitment of migrant workers is concerned, money is over the table. In some countries, it is under the table. In some other countries in South Asia, it includes the table, right? So we need to ensure that when it comes to finances, we need to have a very clear perspective how exactly these finances and this money is being dealt with. Very crucial. You know, in the larger sense, and I'll stop with a few points from the regional setting that we have constantly come across, and then a couple of recommendations. In Sri Lanka, for instance, and Pravina, like PSCD said, will be talking about domestic workers. In Sri Lanka, for instance, domestic workers are actually paid an incentive to migrate, which is actually even worse. Sub-agents play such a key role in Sri Lanka, where if the recruiter, the main recruitment agency in Sri Lanka gets, let's say, $5,000 to recruit a domestic worker to work in the Middle East. that recruitment agency will then give the sub-agent maybe $2,000. And that sub-agent will give half of that $2,000 or maybe 50% of that or lesser than that to the domestic worker as an incentive to migrate. Now, this happens with under very severe circumstances of or that can lead into labor trafficking. So we need to keep that in mind when we talk about the role across the supply chain and the incentives that even migrant workers get in some countries. In Nepal, for instance, I had a sub-agent and a recruitment agent who was at the time working in Sarlahi, the southern district of Nepal in the Madesi region, telling me that he's encouraging migrant workers to go to Malaysia. I asked, why Malaysia? He said, oh, sir, same to same. Now, only people from South Asia will really understand what same to same means. And he says same to same, sir, because in Malaysia, they look the same. The migrant worker can go to a temple in Malaysia if he wants to. You know, when he goes from Nepal, he can speak in his local language, and most probably, he may be understood better than in the Middle East. Now, it's funny they say this because that shows that the recruitment agent has such a huge role in pre-departure orientation. And we need to recognize that pre-departure orientation is not isolated from recruitment. In Bangladesh, the cost of migration, as per a recent survey done by the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, is a minimum of $4,000 for a low-skilled migrant worker, and it takes that migrant worker up to 18 months, so a year and a half, to repay that cost. Now, I'm not saying that this is all the same in India as well, but the point is we need to be able to measure those costs. And for those costs to be measured, there needs to be exactly what MEA now talks about in the context of the whole of government approach by also bringing in, for instance, in the case of India, MOSPI. And therefore, a better appreciation for the measurement of these costs, which PSCD alluded to in 10.7.1. I'll stop with a couple of final points.
You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes.
Great. That's all I need. Thanks, Meera. So then in the last couple of points, it's this. India is the sum of its parts. Let's recognize the fact that we are equal and unequal in all different ways that we are. So if that is the case in terms of that inequities within the country, within how different states are looking at issues, let us ensure that the whole of government approach has the horizontal perspective between different ministries, exactly like what MEA is pushing for, but also in the coordination that we have seen in the context of the vertical line, which is central and state governments. And we've seen this in the context of the Vande Bharat mission in terms of those returning. And the final point is this. It was very interesting. On the 9th of July, the government of India led the first sub-regional meeting in the region, which ILO supported through technical backstopping. And in that conversation, which Secretary Bhattacharya led from the side of the government of India, there were a number of issues that came up as a result of the impact of COVID on migration and migrant workers. What really stood out there was that it was in fact Sri Lanka who set the ball rolling, and Secretary Bhattacharya picked up on it and said exactly this. He said, it is true that now because of COVID, and thanks to the amnesties that Gulf countries like Kuwait and UAE had put forward, we could now see migrant workers who were irregular coming out of the woodworks. That irregularity starts because of unfair recruitment. But in a country where over 90% of the workforce is informal sector or is in the informal sector, how do we ensure fair recruitment? So I think this is not going to be a conversation that ends now. This is a great conversation to have, but I think there's a whole range of things that needs to be looked at to ensure that recruitment is fair and that labor intermediaries are as much a part of the discussion as everybody else. I'll stop with that, Meera. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think you've highlighted two key points where we still do not have a clear consensus on the employee-based principle and then the cost of recruitment. So I think these are both still, the dialogue continues. All right, with that, I call on our next speaker, Dr. Praveena Kodot, who's a professor at the Center of Development Studies in Thiruvananthapuram. And I think we're all familiar with the center. She was a Sir Ratan Tata Fellow, Asia Research Center, London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm sorry, I have a very, very tight summary here. And basically, her area of work, which is very important for this discussion today, is international migration of women and politics and citizenship. So without much ado, I call on Pravina Kodar.
Thank you, Mira. And I'd like to thank the ICM and Surabhi for giving me this opportunity to share some of my work and the perspective that I have on women's migration. My work has been really in the Indian context, but I will refer now and then to other countries as well, putting the Indian experience into perspective. We've already heard about the international conventions that pertain to intermediaries and intermediation, and also about country experiences of especially poorer migrants from different source countries. To begin with, I'd like to say that in the academic literature, intermediaries and intermediation has. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
So intermediaries and intermediation was considered something of a black box until about a decade ago. But there's been a significant outpouring of literature on this particular domain in the recent past. Now, as far as women's migration is concerned, this literature is somewhat uneven. We have a better understanding of intermediaries and the whole process of intermediation, where the country perspective, the source country perspective, has been liberal rather than protectionist. Therefore, the Philippines, for instance, we have a great deal of literature on intermediation. We also have literature on Sri Lanka. These are all countries that have sort of taken a promotional perspective on women's migration and have been quite proactive in understanding the whole process. But in the context of India, intermediation of women's migration remains something of a black box. And we don't have to go very far except to look at our own experience of recent regulation. Two major categories of women migrants were severely, restricted in a sense, or regulation was tightened for two categories. One was the ECR category, the immigration check required category, which basically pertains to migrants who are not, who do not have educational qualifications of at least school leaving standard, which is the 10th standard in India. They basically are manual workers, including domestic workers, but also allied workers who may work in commercial establishments and so on. The other major group of women immigrants, as far as India is concerned, have been nurses. Of course, there have been other qualified workers, but the large numbers of women who go from India are either in the ECR category or they are nurses. And when you look at the recent experience of regulation, nurses who were outside the ECR category because they are educated were actually brought under the ECR category in 2015. And they were brought under the ECR category because in 2015, a huge recruitment scam was uncovered. And it became impossible any longer to deny that private recruitment was really mired in corruption. And of course, corruption included state actors as well. And therefore, it became pertinent to act. And the impulse or the immediate tendency of the Indian government was to bring nurses under the ECR category, notwithstanding that the scandal itself had to do with private intermediaries and the connivance of a protector of immigrants in Kochi, who was actually, the case involved this POE, who had, in fact, not taken action against private intermediaries for not observing the law. And it was really interesting because one of the charges against this POE was that a woman who had paid 19 lakhs 50,000 for being recruited as a nurse to Kuwait, had later decided not to go. And so she had sought that money back. And the recruiting agent refused to pay that money. She did not actually take the recruitment agent to task for being asked to pay a disproportionate amount of money. She was basically extorted, but that was acceptable to these nurses. Such is the demand for these jobs in the Middle East. Now, she took him to task, or she complained because he refused to give her the money back when she said she did not want to go. And that the POE did not act on that complaint. And that is how this came up. In fact, the POE told the recruitment agent about it, and this was part of the big mess, and this blew up. And finally, the action taken by the government was to bring nurses under the immigration check required category. Now, this was to bring women under a bureaucratic controlling mechanism that had actually failed. If you look at the trajectory of that, the course of that particular scam itself, you could see that the bureaucratic controlling mechanism had failed. And yet the impulse of the state was to impose that very mechanism on nurses as well. And we've seen post 2015 that the only purpose that has been served is that initially there was a large decline in the numbers of nurses that have been going, at least going by impression, because we only have data now that they are under the ECR category. We have the data on the numbers of women who are going in the ECR category, but we don't have reliable data, or we don't have, official data of the past. We do have data, but not official data. But going by the data we have, you can see that there has been a large decline. Of course, in the last 2 years, it has increased somewhat, but there have been reports in the media which show that irregular recruitment has continued. The same private recruiters have continued to recruit. And now the recruitment scam did not stop there. In fact, Kuwait actually banned recruitment of nurses from India, which was a big blow to Indian nurses, particularly nurses from Kerala, who really look to employment in the Middle East and have for generations now been really seeking upward mobility through this kind of employment. But Kuwait banned Indian nurses going to Kuwait because these private recruiters had actually bribed Kuwaiti government officials and very high-ranking Kuwaiti government officials as well. So that was the kind of reach that the private recruiting sector had. But you can see that the problem is not a simple one. The problem is highly complex. And as Shabari, I think, mentioned, the complexity of this whole sector, the recruitment industry. And therefore, to really unravel it, to address the issues, in the Indian context, we need to learn from other countries like the Philippines, which has been better at regulation. That does not mean that there are no problems, but also be willing to look at our regulatory framework, really, in terms of what is lacking. Obviously, what was not lacking was not the immigration check required category, going by the previous experience of the ECR category women, but also the experience of nurses after they were brought under the ECR category. Before I go to domestic workers, and I usually talk a lot about domestic workers, so I started with nurses over here, lest they get lost. I do want to say that another consequence of bringing nurses under the ECR category was a change in the direction of migration, which was previously to the better paying, more dynamic market economies of Kuwait, the UAE, etc. And then if you look at the ECR statistics now, you'll find that the bulk of recruitment is to Saudi Arabia, where the terms of employment for nurses is far worse. So, you have this kind of restriction being enabling for worse, worse standard countries, in a sense, labor standard countries, to then come and recruit from India. Whereas, better countries with better labor market conditions, where Indian workers had been able to make better gains, have, receded. Kuwait has closed, UAE still remains there. And one of the reasons that, women have been able to go despite these stringent regulations is the fact that they've had historically very strong networks. private networks and connections, which Indian women have really used to their advantage. So much so that Indian women, particularly Malayali women, have been able to stay the course with the Philippines as far as nursing is concerned. Though Philippines is an export promotion country, and India does very little really to enable its women migrant workers. Now, a point that I do want to make, which links both domestic workers and nurses, is that often we find, or quite consistently we find, that when there is regulation put in place, or when regulation is tightened and restrictions are put in place, the impulse is not to enable the freedoms or the labor market rights of women workers. Rather, it is to control women and their mobility. And this, not so much in the case of nurses who belong largely to a more privileged community that is able to lobby with the state to get better outcomes, but especially in the case of domestic workers who belong to the oppressed communities in this country, who have very little voice, very little voice in the policy making process. The Joint Secretary actually mentioned that the most important people are the migrant workers, the poor migrant workers. But this is a group.
Pravina, you have 2 minutes to wrap up, please.
Who have very little voice in the policy making process, and they depend extensively on intermediaries. As far as domestic workers are concerned, intermediaries are almost entirely informal and irregular, with the exception of the public sector recruiting agencies who began to recruit only in 2016. Prior to that, though there was no barrier against the public sector agencies recruiting, they shied away, they stayed away, consistently saying that this is a messy sector, it will do harm to our image. So the concern was not the interests of the women workers, but it was really the image of the agencies there. And when you come to what has happened post 2016, and several agencies have begun to recruit, you will find, especially my fieldwork in Kerala has shown, that women workers are not so willing to be recruited by the government agencies because of the class divide that separates them, which has created a trust deficit. On the other hand, who are these irregular intermediaries who many of them do exploit? Some of them exploit heinously, but others exploit and yet provide a pathway for women to gain upward mobility. Who are these intermediaries? They are people of the same social class as these women, and therefore they build social relations. And to end, I want to say that and therefore, if you come to intermediation from below, from the perspectives of the women who have been recruited, you get a completely different perspective from the one that actually homogeneously or unilaterally sees in irregular, informal intermediaries as only exploitative, as basically the principal agents of the exploitation of women, and targets them for elimination and prohibition. They are at present banned from recruiting women domestic workers, but let me end by saying the bulk of women domestic workers who go today go through these banned agencies. So there's a lesson to be learned there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that was very, very important. And just to highlight one additional point, that now with under the COVID-19, we have now a lot of countries, destination countries, who are changing their laws and trying to get more and more health workers, including nurses, given the acute shortages. So, and again, it's women. So thank you for those interventions. I now call on our last speaker, Dr. Sushil Kumar Madhusudhanan, who's the managing director of Seagull Group of Companies. And I'm pleased to say that his company for 2 consecutive years, 2017 and 18, has won the Excellence Award for promoting quality and innovation in the human resource category. He's one of the rated as one of the top recruitment agencies, and he operates in 7 countries, in UAE, in Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, as well as in Qatar. So I may call on him now. Dr. Sushil Kumar Sudhanan, please, over to you.
Can you hear? Is audible?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the introduction, madam. Good afternoon, Sri Abhagani Ramu, Sri Yogeshwar Swangwan, Dr. Surabhi Singh, Dr. Meera Sethi, Dr. Priyasiri Vikrama Shekhara, Mr. Shaveri Nair, and Dr. Praveena Kodot, and Mr. Piyush Gupta, and the attendees and the viewers across the social media. It is indeed a pleasure to be the part of this webinar based on role of labor intermediaries, issues and challenges. I express my sincere gratitude to ICM for taking such an initiative and understanding and recognizing the role of recruitment agents in the nation building. I would like to thank Sri Yogeshwar Sangwan, Protector General of Immigrants, Sri Sanjeev Bhattacharya, the Secretary, Sri V. Muralidhar, the Minister of State for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, for their support towards the recruitment fraternity, and it has created a positive vibe among the recruitment fraternity. As the concept provided by the ICM, there are 7 subjects has been initiated, and I thought that actually I can able to complete the 7 subject in the time given to me. The first one is refining the roles and highlighting the issues and the challenges of labor intermediaries. I'd like to state that actually our nation's demography has large pool of employable adults, far more than the available jobs within the country. Under the labor intermediaries, Indian recruitment agencies have played a vital role in reducing the number of unemployment Indians by sourcing job opportunities across the world, especially in the GCC countries. Identifying the demand and supply imbalance, the RA has previous 4 decades have ensured gainful employment for millions of Indians in the Middle East. RA provides an average 2 million jobs every year. And the recent year, these numbers has been drastically come down with various reasons which we all are aware. The positive outcome of the employment-related immigration is the steady rise in the remittance in the form of official foreign exchange, which we receive every year. In the year 2019 itself, it was around 83 billion US dollar. Out of that, around 30% are from the GCC countries itself. The latest report by McKinsey analyzed that actually by 2030, India needs to create at least 90 million new jobs, absorb the 60 million new workers who will enter the workforce based on the current demographics, and an additional 30 million workers who have from farm work to more productive or non-farming sectors. Owing to uncertainties due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the steps taken to mitigate the widespread reaction, the reforms to ensure it would be have implemented in the next 12 to 8 months. India's economy was already showing sign of weakness before the COVID-19. After the global financial crisis, COVID was a double blow for the struggling industry and employment creativity. Here we think about the utilizing the talents. India has got one of the largest youth population in the world with an average of 15 million people enter the job markets every year. An average of 7 million jobs are created formal sector and 3.5 million are in informal sectors. Rest of the people has to look other opportunities, including one in the overseas jobs. Here RI can play a major role with support of government of India. When we discuss about the key issues the recruitment fraternity is facing, because we always talk about certain issues, our honorable PG is also there. The one of the key area is minimum referral wages. Minimum referral wages has been fixed 30 to 40% higher than the prevailing market rate. And we are continuously following with this office and the ministry to withdraw this order. This way affect lot of recruitment coming to India. And next is the responsibility of RS, because before that, Mr. Shabirinath and Madam Praveena has told about the issues what the recruitment agencies are facing actually. The candidates deployed by him should be more time barred to the promotion period and mentioned in the contract to maximum 6 months from the date of joining of the FCs. The RI cannot be held responsible for any untoward development during the time of workers' contract with the FE. give importance to the intermediaries with limited liabilities. When the FE has registered with the Indian mission with proper check and documentation, an employment contract has signed by the FE in the destination country, the responsibility should be with the FE and the Indian mission of the destination country. Need to defend the role of RAs, FEs, and immigration in the coming immigration management bill. And for that, we suggest that actually a single window grievance redressal mechanism should be set up to deal with the complaint from the overseas workers. The next point is developing the strategies to improve regulations and frameworks to tackle issues arising due to the economic downturn and the changing skill levels. COVID is on the one hand and economic downturn is on the other hand. We are facing challenges arising by the technology development, changing skill level demand, geographic shift in demand for labor. We see new sector emerging as more popular other than the declining in demand. RAs are potential for employers and employment opportunities overseas. They are supplying from India and adjusting and adapting the new environment. Ministry of External Affairs should simplify the recruitment process more friendly for immigrants and recruitment agencies. Both Government of India and the recruitment agencies should join together as partners to enhance the job opportunities abroad. The next point is flagging authorization issue and informal channels in major migration corridors from India. The biggest threat to the overseas recruitment is the illegal and unscrupulous agents who are recruiting both ECR and ECNR categories by placing advertisements in the newspaper, social media, and online portal. Complaint to the police against such operators hardly evoke any response. These illegal operators tarnish the reputation of the entire industry and they need to be dealt with stern action. In order to avoid this, we suggest that ECR and ECNR passports should be routed through the recruitment agencies and a single page registration should be made in the e-migrate portal to register the ECNR categories. In the proposed management bill, we suggested all immigrants, the category of semi-skilled, unskilled should be recruited through registered recruitment agencies irrespective of any country. The point number 4 is stressing the need for closer cooperation between labor intermediaries and government bodies to ensure beneficial of migration. The recruitment industry takes the initiative to bring employment to India. Even the unskilled and semi-skilled workers who work abroad for 2 to 3 years come back to India as highly skilled technicians, having worked with the latest equipments and facilities abroad. This creates a huge skill base and Indian industry at zero cost to the country. Need to bring an ecosystem to include stakeholders in the policy decision by ministry, and it will bring a confidence among the fraternity. And the simplification of e-migrate is one of the other area. FE recruiting small numbers can easily register their recruiting and small number of workers has to be allowed. And the next one is the export status or services being rendered to business entities situated outside India, also utilized by them outside India, qualifies to be the nature of export. Hence, any financial transaction that is an outcome of business contract should have same benefit applicable to an export industry. The next point is GST on unemployed youth. The successful candidate who have been selected has to unfortunately pay 18% GST before taking up the employment. The individual by going abroad on employment, in fact, contributing much more by bringing down domestic unemployment, remitting foreign exchange, and ensuring this family is not a burden on the administration. As far as the foreign remittance received by the RS, in the earlier regime of service tax, manpower export companies were exempted from the levy due to the inflow of foreign exchange, and our services are utilized outside India. But in the present GST regime, there is no clear indication has been given. We have written to concerned authorities and met the finance minister. Still, there is no positive reply has received. We request MEA to take up this matter with relevant authorities. And skilling and upskilling. RA are doing a skilling and upskilling for the last 40 years. We are not getting an adequate support from NSDC or the Ministry of Skill Development. The initiative taken by NSDC has not given the desired result. RSR once can identify the facilities and skill sets, can take up the challenges by skilling and upskilling with the support of MEA. And language is a main barrier for many of the candidates traveling abroad to many countries. And we need to have an ecosystem to bridge the gap between this. And to the next one is the digital transformation requirements for smoother facilitation and placement. In the defining role of recruitment agents in the post-COVID scenario, digitalization is going to play a major role in the recruitment industry too. There will be a transformation in the workplace, working module, work culture, and recruitment, etc. Many FEs will not be preferred to come to India for recruitment, and rather than they will prefer for video conferencing for the interviews and trade test. Even they come, they will prefer to visit only the metro cities. RA has to select the candidate on behalf of FEs, and responsibility of the RA will increase. Many jobs will be outsourced and work at home culture is increasing nowadays. And back-end operation of activities of many FEs will shift to the countries like India, Vietnam, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and etc. Talent exchanges and short-term labor leasing and hiring between companies will be in process. Many FEs will locally, and a lot of changes may happen in the labor laws of the destination country. My sixth point is developing the robust rating process for RS in alignment with international standards. RS should be given an incentive according to their performance and the amount of foreign exchange they earn. There is a strong objection from members that this will have a double standard on smaller players, as they may lose their potential business to bigger RS due to the tough competition in the trading system. And the next one is generating awareness among migrants regarding fraud and RS. What Mr. Shabiri Nair clearly indicated that what is the hurdle an RA has facing to recruit people, they need to go certain hurdles. The main problem what we are facing is that illegal or unscrupulous agents recruiting both ECR or ECNR categories by placing advertisements in Indian newspapers. Complaint to police against such operators hardly evoke any response. These illegal operators tarnish the reputation of the entire industry, and we need to have certain measures to deal with these agents. And all of I already said that actually to eradicate this thing, all the registration, all the people going abroad has to be routed through e-migrate portal. I conclude with the MA and Indian Mission should provide a scope and details of employment opportunities in the destinations countries to RA association through an ecosystem to bridge the gap between RS and Government of India. This will enable to create a lot of job opportunities for our young job aspirants. A delegation of stakeholders should visit the respective country with the cooperation of FICCI, ASSOCHAM and MEA to explore the opportunities in the country. The Government of India should focus on resuming the flight operation to GCC countries, and many employees are in need of manpower from India. Bilateral discussion should be initiated to issue the employment visa, and mobilization should be taken care strictly with the COVID parameters. This will enable the job seekers, RF fraternity, to reboot their business in the COVID context. Once again, I thank you for your patient hearing, and we hope that and expect a positive outcome from the discussion and the deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Those were extremely rich set of recommendations you have made, and I hope ICM has taken a note of all of them. And you have touched on at least 10 to 12 different points. It's impossible for me to even, but I'm very glad that these are some very important elements which are really needed, and we hope that these are some steps that can be taken forward. So it gives us.
Thank you, madam.
We have about 10 minutes.
And since I am the only one representing the fraternity, I thought of sharing all this information.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, sir. I think we can take about 10 minutes or 15 minutes for some questions, 2 or 3 questions, because we have Mr. Piyush Gupta, who is the director of OR1, who will also be making closing remarks. So I don't want us to take up his time. So we have about 10, 12 minutes to take some questions. So the floor is open, please. And Surbi, I think you'll be helping us with the questions, please.
Yes, but there are no questions in the chat. So if anyone wants to speak, they can do so.
Yeah, I would like to speak.
Yes, please.
All right, please.
I'm Abdul
Let's
Karim.
introduce yourself and
Yeah.
also not more than 2 minutes so we can have
Yeah.
more speakers come in.
Yes,
Thank
so
you very
better
much.
not to waste time. I'm Abdul Karim. I was the former chairman of FORAI and the immediate past president of IPEPSIL. Here, first of all, the expression role of labor intermediaries, I would like to say the expression itself is not appropriate, I believe. That should be the role of HR placement intermediaries or facilitators. I would recommend. Then at this COVID contest, I would say in front of us, there are a lot of challenges. The revival of the sector is the most important task we should debate. For that, our Honorable PG is Protector General of Immigrants is there in our webinar. So what I would like to say is that to simplify the immigrant process of foreign employer registration and all the clearance, all the immigration process, all the recruitment process should be based on the MOU between the host country and the exporting country. But whatever the agreements between the host and the exporting country, government level execute the MOU. That should be the main document for the FE registration as well as immigration clearance and all contractual obligations for the immigrant after the placement. If the government cannot control any violation of the contractual obligations, how the government expect a pure RA sitting here who is a felicitator, a intermediary, can make it happen? So it should be absolutely based on the MOU signed by both host country and the export country. And our Indian mission has to have a POI division to take care of that in case of any contractual violations take place to get the right to the immigrant. So in that single process, the FE registration will be simplified and RA liabilities will be very limited. That responsibility with the government arm, which is the protector of immigrants, and protector of immigrants should not be the protector of immigrants. Being a regulator, they should be the protector of the RAs as well. This is what within the short period I would like to say. Otherwise, I can cover entire topic elaborately, but there are other speakers. So this is my humble submission to ICM and to extend it to the MEA and regulatory body with the robust version is coming up in the e-migrate. All these simplification has to be done and before it's placed in the parliament, all that amendment has to be done to simplify all the recruitment process so that India will get a very good demand. That is the challenge in front of us. So the RF fraternity has to be taken into confidence to focus on the job and to bring large number of demand to Indian unemployed youth. That our RF fraternity can guarantee at least 20 lakh people in a year for overseas placement if the government support the fraternity with this simplification process. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul Karim. If there are no other questions, maybe I could
I would
ask.
like to.
I think there are two questions, Meera. One is from Mr. Professor Khadaria, and one is from Fahad from Cosmos International.
Mine is, thank you. Meera, can I just come in?
Yes, please, Mr. Khadaria.
This is not a question, but what I have learned from the deliberations is extremely important, and I wish that amongst the audience we had some migrants who have gone through the experience of different kinds of exploitation that have been mentioned, and Sabri has particularly dissected the anatomy of exploitation. in terms of the costs and fees. And in fact, he also said under the table, over the table, and including the table, which is atrocious, which is an extreme form of exploitation. And then he also gives the example of Sri Lanka, where it's a reverse kind of incentive. He calls it, I will call it a bribe, for migrants to migrate, by just simply by at the alluring of pittance that is being given and what lies ahead, they're completely ignorant. So my plea would be that we need to not only simplify the procedures, but also the other side of the procedure, the violation of the procedure should be simplified. That should be, and that's where I think migrants who is at the receiving end should be made aware of, the activists should be made aware of. We go on protesting without knowing the details of these things. I think that is extremely important, and I think and Sabri has explained it very, very well. And for the first time, I have understood what it involves. Thank you very much.
Madam, I want to talk to you. Only 2 minutes, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Madam, I am Mr. Athar Siddiqui from Anjum Travel Agency, Bombay. मैं आपको बताना चाहता हूँ कि जो न्यू इमिग्रेशन एक्ट आ रहा है, या आप कह सकते हैं 1983 एक्ट में अमेंडमेंट आ रहा पार्लियामेंट में, बहुत जरूरी है कि पार्लियामेंट में पेश होने से पहले हमारे आईपीएफएल फैटर्निटीज है, कम से कम 3 आदमी जाए मीटिंग में पेश होने से पहले, और फेस टू फेस मिनिस्टर साहब से और हमारे पीजी साहब से हम बहुत शुक्रगुजार हैं। हमारे सांगवान साहब से, बहुत टैलेंटेड और क्वालिफाइड प्रोटेक्टर जनरल बहुत दिन बाद आए हैं, वो भी हमको बहुत सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं। हम चाहते हैं कि ये बिल पेश होने से पहले आईपीएफएल के कम से कम 3 ऑफिस बियरर और वहाँ बैठें और अपनी ग्रीवेंसेस बताएं। आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, आपने ये मीटिंग अरेंज किया, इतना शॉर्ट में मैं कहूँगा। और दूसरी बात जहाँ तक है रैंकिंग देने की, ये अच्छा ही नहीं लगती। एक तो हम लोग वाले बहुत मुसीबत से गुजर रहे हैं बिकॉज ऑफ कोविड, और कोई कम एम्प्लॉयमेंट करता है, कोई ज्यादा करता है। इसमें कोई रैंकिंग नहीं होनी चाहिए कि कोई क्लास 4 स्टार है या कोई 5 स्टार है। इट शुड नॉट बी देयर। दैट्स इट मैम, बस यही मेरी एक छोटी सी रिक्वेस्ट। थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर टॉकिंग टू यू। थैंक यू।
So very quickly, Meera, I think we should have Fahad and then Sita. 1 minute each.
Yeah, okay. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Fahad and I'm from Cosmos International, Mumbai. The points that I witnessed here, thank you so much, was really eye-opener for me. And I have certain things that I would request you to please consider. The first point is to kindly limit the role of RAs. We are RAs. We are, that we have to deal with the immigrants here, with the embassies, bureaucrats in India, as well as the clients in the Gulf. And in spite of doing everything legally, there is no limit on our role or responsibility, liabilities, to be the correct word. We don't have any limited liabilities. Even if a worker goes to through us for recruitment 10 years back, 5 years back, he changes his employment, he comes back on vacation, makes a new contract. Still, if he has some problem after all these things, we are made liable. So, you have to review this situation. And secondly, if our roles and liabilities are still, not made clear, how can we have a rating system, ma'am? Because these points are included in making the ratings. If you have to rate someone, you have to see the complaints raised against him, his employment, how many people is employed. But when the complaints are not regulated, there are so many frivolous complaints, fake complaints against us, and then these parameters are used to rate us, then this is not fair. Thirdly, the rating system, I think, should be first. My suggestion would be to first regularize the parameters discuss the parameters with all the stakeholders, and then come out with the rating system. Instead of like last time it happened, the ratings came out first, and then there were so many grievances and so many loopholes in them. So it's better that first discuss these with the stakeholders, the points, the parameters, and then you come out with a system which is foolproof. That is what I would like to say. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. May I call on Sita now? And I think we have another request. Perhaps, Surbhi, it's all right. Should we take both?
Yeah, we can just take 2 questions more maybe and then give the floor back to panelists for a minute each to respond before we close.
All right. So we have Sita, and then we have one other lady who has asked for the floor. So one minute each, please.
Sure. Thanks, Meera. Thank you so much. Just very quickly, I really want to pick on what Praveena was saying in terms of social relations, because I think my experience from the ground and having spent time with subagents and migrants in the, right at the ground, this is absolutely true. The subagents are the heroes of the show. They are the people, they don't know the RAs or the migrants. They know the subagents, and the subagents are the heroes of the show. It does not help us as a community to be looking at it through a punishment lens. This doesn't help the migrant. So we really need to find balance between doing the right thing and helping them to do the right thing, but also making sure that we're not pulling them down, because that doesn't help anyone. And I want to point this back out to the entire recruitment community. We've been working with you, and you know this. I've been working with you for the last 7-8 years. We're way ahead today compared to where we were a few years ago in terms of the dialogue with the Ministry of External Affairs, and we're all very grateful that that is happening. But that is exactly the kind of dialogue that needs to happen across levels and across layers of intermediation. We cannot expect that one group can have the dialogue and the others cannot, or that the others are villains in the show, because they really may not be the villains in the show. So I think the point here is that I'm trying to say is that we need to open dialogue spaces. We really need to reach out to more intermediaries and find ways to engage with them. And at the same time, for the recruiters also, I think you also need to come together more. This a lot, but it would be really good to also have the voices coming together a lot more, because that would really help everybody and the country really to grapple with this migration issue and to grapple with intermediation that takes place. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I have one other speaker who asked for the floor.
Yeah, that would be the last question that we take today. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Ramesh, are you there? Ms. Sunita Ramesh, are you there? I think we don't have her.
Shall I say one
So
more
we,
word?
so we really need to give the floor back to the panelists also once, so that they can respond.
All right, so shall we then go in the same order? And I may call on our first panelist and give each of you maybe 1 minute to make some last comments that you'd like to add on. So Dr. Piasuri, may I call on you first?
Thank you. Actually, there was no question directly addressed to me, but I just want to add a couple of points. One is about MOUs, bilateral MOUs. It was mentioned, I didn't get it very clear, but I have to highlight that I have done a lot of work on bilateral agreements and MOUs. And in my view, they are a very weak instrument, because especially they are superimposed on existing flows, and the fact that 2 governments sign an agreement does not change anything. The same recruitment agents send workers in the same way. Migrant workers are not even aware that they are migrating under a new agreement. The same employers in the destination country exploit workers. They are not even informed about this new agreement. So I think we have to think of ways to make them more effective, because at the moment they are just, publicity instruments as far as I can see. Because in my analysis of Indian bilateral MOUs in 2011, the Migrant Forum in Asia, I said the title was "Something is Better Than Nothing," because I found very little achievements. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, may I call on Shabri now?
Thanks, Meera. I mean, it was actually great to hear from all the interventions as well. Look, I find it very difficult to now say in 1 minute exactly what would be the main points. I'm just thinking post-COVID now. If I were to look at it, what is post-COVID? I think we're going to live with COVID as a part of this new normal, and how are we then going to build back better within this recruitment space that we are talking about? So in that context, let's accept one thing very clearly, and that is with regards to what the recruitment agents have to bring to the table. I think Sita made a very important point there, and it's important to recognize that. Now, within that, if I were to look at what recruitment agencies need and how we can support them, I'm thinking of this one. Earlier this morning we were in a conversation with amongst a few of us, and Ali, I didn't hear from you today, but Ali made a very important point about trust. Trust between employers and the recruitment agencies, the employers and the workers and the recruitment agencies. And I think this trust factor is going to be so important going forward. The number of people who have now come back having lost their wages. Think of all those people who've had to borrow money in the first place before they migrated to pay for their recruitment costs, and now have come back because they've lost jobs in the Middle East. As of the ILO's fourth COVID monitoring report, 8 million jobs are expected to be lost in this year in the Middle East, in the Arab states. Migrant workers are the first to be fired and the last to be hired. Now, within that context, we need to recognize that this trust factor is going to be huge. And to quantify that trust factor, we need better data. We need to be able to measure some of those costs. So if we were to look at some of these elements going forward, I think that in itself would be a good step forward. Thanks, Mira.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you raised the point of data that was missing. All right, shall I call on our third panelist now, Dr. Praveen Kodak, to please make some last remarks?
Praveena,
sorry.
That's okay. Okay, thank you. So I do want to make one or 2 points. One is about the issue of cost. Shabari did mention, go into it in some detail, but I just want to add a little point here about how costs can be so misleading and how the framework must really be formulated by understanding this very slippery nature of costs. Now, one of the things that I came across during my recent field work was that domestic workers across the board in source regions in India, southern India, were not being charged any expenses. They said this uniformly, and it was really surprising for me. And this was linked to the huge increase in demand in the Middle East, where the Middle Eastern countries are literally scouting for domestic workers, and Kerala and Andhra Pradesh are traditional areas, so there is some familiarity with these workers. But they were not being charged any cost. But along with that, there were a whole lot of reports about how domestic workers in the Middle East were being held hostage when they wanted to return because they had not paid up. The recruiting agents were actually extracting money from them and not allowing them to come back before finishing their contract because they were losing out on their profits. So it's very important, really. I mean, whoever pays costs, it's really very important that we make our framework such that your freedoms are not inhibited. Right? Even if you have to pay up your cost of going there and then allowed to earn your money, it's important that your freedoms are not constrained in this manner. So on the face of it, maybe they're not paying the cost, but then there is, a twist to the tail, really. And that's the point. And in fact, I also came across this, Shabari, that in Andhra Pradesh, women were being incentivized. There were women who had been given 10,000 rupees because the amount paid by the sponsor is being distributed down the line. There are large numbers of stakeholders. And the moment a woman goes there and says, no, I don't want to stay, I want to go back, all of these people are affected. So she just completely loses her freedom. One more point, if I may, which I didn't quite make. I came around, I was getting into it and I forgot, I think, which links domestic workers and or exposes the disparity in domestic workers and nurses migration. And that is that when the nurses were brought under the immigration check required mechanism, the government order actually said that for the moment, initially, recruitment will be only through public sector agencies. And in fact, this was publicized as a ban on private recruiting agents. And immediately, private recruiting agents went to the court. And in fact, they got their way. The government immediately stepped back. When the same thing was done to domestic workers, there was deafening silence. What does that say? Look at the class perspective. I think India really should take note of that, because our domestic workers, like Meera said, both domestic workers and nurses are in huge demand in the Middle East now. Nurses for obvious reasons, domestic workers, it's there in literature because aging is advancing, and also because women's work participation rates among nationals has really registered a huge increase. So both these are in demand, while male workers, the demand is on the decline. So are we going to provide the conditions that will empower women? We started with empower, right? Empower women to claim their rights. And how are we going to do that? And PDOT or training is very important, but training has to be really revised such that it isn't clamming women with information. It is giving them a methodology to learn. That is what training must do. How do you learn once you're there? What do you do? That methodology is what we need to impart to women, because they can't learn a language in 2 hours or 3 days or even 15 days. They can only learn it on the job. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So may I just call on our last panelist, Dr. Suresh Kumar Nathusudanam. You are given half a minute, sir.
Oh, half a minute I may not be able to complete. Okay, I will just focus on what Sida has said, that the sub-agents, even in my speech also, I have emphasized the issues what the recruitment agents are facing. India, approximately 1,500 registered recruitment agents are there. And if you see the complaints which you normally get is 0.01% about the registered recruitment agencies. But the complaint which normally is getting is exploiting the sub-agents or the other touts. This is the thing has to be taken very seriously. And to can control this illegal or unscrupulous sub-agents, this industry can have some sort of a glory. Otherwise, this will happen and this will be a continuous process. And plus, Mr. Abdul Karim, what he said is that actually we need to honor the bilateral agreement between the destination country and the Indian government, and should honor. And whatever the issues is coming in the destination country has to be taken care by the Indian mission. And if you see the Philippines model, because Philippines is handling it very.
We should really work on the Philippines model, whatever it is.
And Philippines is doing a very good job as far as the number of complaints are. But we do agree that actually we don't have sufficiently equipped with Indian mission in the destinations country, and that has to be taken care. That's all, madam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think there have been some agencies. I remember ILO, IOM, my former agency, were doing work on sub-agents, and I agree. We've got to bring them in the loop with them. All right, I think, Surbi, we have finished our role here, and I would like to thank the panelists. And maybe I may now call on Mr. Piyush Gupta for a vote of thanks and his closing remarks.
Afternoon, everybody.
I think we have lost.
No, he's there. He's there.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
You can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Shri Yogeshwar Sangwan, Protector General of India. Shri Abagini Ramu, JSYA1. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. On behalf of India Center for Migration and MEA, and of course on my own behalf, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for presenting their work and analysis on this crucial issue today. Sincere thanks to our moderator, Dr. Meera Sethi, for efficiently coordinating the discussion. Let me also take this opportunity to express my thanks to JSYA1 for delivering today's opening remarks. My sincere thanks to all of our invitees for their crucial insights and interventions on the issue. This virtual discussion on role of labor intermediaries and their issue and challenges. The first, on the theme organized by ICM, as a need was felt to understand the intermediaries as an important factor in migration cycle that facilitate and ensure safe migration and mobility. With the changing migration flows, it was also necessary to not only analyze the roles of labor intermediaries, but also to enable them to adapt to future growth and development. There have been several significant changes in the role and structure of one of our core intermediaries. It is a recruiting agents, RAs. Here also there is a pressing need to limit the growth of unscrupulous recruiting agents operating in India. I find in 2019, 769 cases against illegal agents were referred to the state governments. It's quite a large number. Our intermediaries of e-migration must rise to the challenge of tackling the post-COVID scenario and adapt to innovative waves to building a robust immigration system. I believe today's deliberations have been fruitful and contributive towards adopting policies conducive to safe immigration. So thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Before we all leave, I would request all of you to kindly turn on your cameras so that we can take a group picture and we can have everyone who has joined us today in the photo frame. Thank you.